So just to go along with that PowerPoint, if we go to content by type here and down to the notes and solutions, I threw up this example solution for dynamic filtering. So it's again our medical office, but it's got a few extra things thrown in, including a page using this approach, right? So I already baked it earlier. Pull it out of the oven. Oh, here it is when it's all done, right? So here's our database that we have, and double clicking on it, here are our stored procedures. So as I said, please go through the videos I have posted. They show you how you can modify and create new stored procedures and so on. But just to quickly summarize it, you might start off, obviously one of the ones you probably have already is the select by foreign key, right, in a given example. So you can just double click on these stored procedures. It will open it up in the designer. And then basically what you can do is if you change the name and execute the update option, it will just create the new stored procedure. If you don't change the name and you modify it and click the update option up here, then it replaces with a new version of the stored procedure. Even though it says create, it does it as an alter, right? Okay, so that's how you make a new stored procedure. If you have one that's close already, then why do it from scratch, right? Take one that's close, open it, modify it, change the name, and just click up the update link here, go through the steps to actually generate the new stored procedure. Okay, so select by doctor. Now see I had actually modified this one by accident, so if I said no, I didn't want to do that, I'll take that out, then I can just update the stored procedure. Just say update database, and away we go. So now I'll have a new version of that stored procedure. So I won't take too long on that because, as I said, the video's up there where I step through and make a whole bunch of incremental changes to stored procedures following the same approach. What I will do is I'll focus on my select by X stored procedure, and we'll just see how it was set up. Again, the video's up there where I build it a stage at a time and explain it, but just for today we're just going to kind of go through it quickly. Quickly, if Visual Studio wants to respond to me. Okay. So select by X, X just meaning any number of unknown filter values, right? Select by anything, okay? Anything that we have set up. So in this case, notice I have parameters set up here for our foreign key, right? Our doctor ID. I also, in the name, right? So some text values. So notice I'm using a varchar, right? So I can type up to 50 characters and search for it inside the name of the patient, right? This is returning patients in our medical office database. We have a start and end value, right? Set up now 10 characters to hold a standard date, right? So 4-digit year, the dash, 2 digits, dash, 2 digits, right? That fits in 10 characters. So that's why I set it as varchar 10. Now, what is this though? The equals an empty string. Do you remember from TSQL when you do that in a stored procedure? What do we call that? It's a default. Yeah, we're giving it a default value. So if we don't pass any other value, sorry, I thought you said default. I'm giving you more credit than you deserve, right? You were very close. Okay. So basically I'm saying we'll default these to empty strings, so if nothing comes from the user interface for these parameters, right, then we already have something, so we won't get errors later on when we try to work with it, right? It won't be null, it'll have something in it. Yeah?
Why are we using empty strings for date? Like instead of just assigning it to null by default?
Because again, this is from experience, if you look for nulls, then certain types of clients have a hard time passing a null, but can pass an empty string. So just from years of doing this, I've found this is the reliable way that always works, right? That's what it comes down to. It would work with a null using a web form as a client. We could do it that way. But there are other clients that can't pass a null, right? So anyway, all right. So as usual, we set no count on, right? Whatever returning data, okay? We don't want it to do that, so then we just start checking now the values. So if we don't have a start value for our date range, okay, it's for the date of birth in this case, right? Then we set it to the oldest date the system can support, which is the year 1, January 1st on the year 1, right? If we don't have a value for the end, we go to the highest value that a datetime 2 in TSQL can support, which is pretty far in the future, okay? You know, we're going to have another one of those year 2000 crisis by the time we get to that year, but let's face it, we'll be all long gone before then, so it'll be somebody else's problem by the year 9999, okay? That the fact they'll have to adjust all their code and all their computer programs in the world. Okay, you get the idea. All right, so that gives me, I can substitute then, if no data comes from the user interface in these string value parameters for the start and end, then I can substitute values that will work as the most extreme range that I could compare to anyway. Then we just actually make date parameters, right? And we cast, okay, as date, we cast our strings into actual start date and end date values. We have to do that because the between operator we use down here for the date of birth between, you have to actually have the right data type to compare with the data type of the field you're using. Okay, so if you're using decimals, you're looking for, you know, say you're filtering invoices, right? That the net amount is between this value and that value, right? Then you use a decimal data type probably in the database to hold the currency amount. And then you just make sure these are cast to the right value there. Okay, so most of this work is all to do those darn dates, right? All that stuff comes along with our date parameters being passed in. The rest of it is pretty straightforward, right? This should look familiar. Our first where clause is just exactly the same as we've done for our foreign key already, right? And, right, so we can keep on adding more and more criteria to further narrow down. Now that's something that you do sometimes in the real world, have to actually have different versions of a stored procedure. It's hard to switch that logic. But most situations, this is what you're after. You have a large amount of data, so by adding more criteria, you're further narrowing down, right, the data to find the record or records that you're after, right? So normally we use an AND, right, because that means it has to satisfy the first condition and the second condition and the third condition, right? It has to satisfy all three if you have values for all the parameters. They have to be of a certain doctor, right? Have a certain text in the name and a date of birth between the ranges specified. You could do this with OR, and then every parameter you add widens the search. That does happen in the real world. But in that case, you would definitely need to use a different stored procedure form, right? It's hard to change that with just a parameter passed in. Okay, but this is the normal situation, is we use AND to put each sort of phrase of the overall Boolean test together. So the next one, the patient summary. Now this is something that comes from our view, right? Feel free to have a look at the view, but it's a concatenation of the name, the first name, the last name, dash, and the date of birth, right? That's the summary value that's in this database as set up, right? So by searching the patient summaries, because it is a single field coming from the view, it means we don't have to worry about the logic of checking in either the first name or the last name and so on, because it's all put together, right? So we can search the patient summary for anything like our string, and notice it's set up to do the wildcard character at the end of the parameter, so it'll find it if it starts with the characters we've passed in. We're going to do it that way because later on the user interface, the actual web form, is set up with logic to actually add the extra wildcard character at the beginning if you want to do a contains instead of a starts. Okay? And that's basically it. So those are the three different things we can filter by: the foreign key, the doctor, some text contained either in or starting the patient summary value, and then the date of birth inside of a range. Okay, so that's the stored procedure. Let's have a look at the web form now. By the way, we do have, of course, I do have a separate patient page where you can maintain that. So for validation, we did add this to our web config file. Just a reminder that you'll get that error message if you try to do any validation without that. I do also have models set up here for both doctor and patient. Now I did include the doctor We aren't adding new doctors or maintaining doctors at this stage. We just haven't added a web form to do so. But I do have the patient class here. All right, so this is set up for the dynamic validation. I don't know why I'm showing that to you right now, because I'm probably just going to confuse you. It's nothing to do with the filter, so let me get back to the point. Okay, let's go to, I could have left that open, but anyway, dynamic patient filter, right? So here's our web form that we're going to focus on. Okay, so what I have here is, that's just the one that has the data for the drop-down list of doctors, right? The foreign key lookup values that we always use, right? So it only has the select command defined to be the select stored procedure that returns the doctor list. Okay, that's our standard approach for that. Data source patients, it has no action query set up either. Remember, this is just like a report page. We aren't maintaining patients here. We're just being able to filter them by all these different criteria. So you'll see that if I run the configuration wizard. Right? Notice there's nothing here for insert, update, and delete, just the select. So we're using that same store procedure we just looked at there. Patient select by X by multiple values, right? So because we have so many parameters though, we have to define for each one where it's going to get its value, right? Well, we've done this before where our foreign key, our doctor ID, that parameter for that, gets it from our drop-down list, our doctor filter drop-down list as the control source. No change there, same approach we've already done. Okay, for our text box where we're going to search inside the name, I just want to show you, here's where we have to be a bit careful about that one fact that web forms will substitute a blank text box, they'll substitute null. And our parameter is set up to look for an empty string. So to make sure it works properly, you have to click this blue underlined link here, show advanced properties. And then what you can see here is convert empty string to null. It's Boolean, true or false. Make sure it's set to false. Okay, we'll look at it in the code. You can always do this in code instead of in this little wizard in the dialog box, right? Now start and end, exactly the same thing. Notice that convert empty string to null is set to false for those inputs as well. If I click hide advanced properties, then I can see the actual name of the text box, txt start and txt end, right? But it's always good to just check and make sure that that is set to false, because we don't want to substitute and send null values. We want to send the empty string. So that's basically it to use it inside of here, right? I can test the query, but it's hard to make it work inside this test environment. You've got to provide values of the right types and so on. So we'll just see it actually work inside the form. No, we don't want to replace anything. We're good. Okay. All right, so that's good for that. Now, let's talk a bit about, so here's our drop-down list for the doctor. No big surprise here. Our data source is just our DS doctor list, right? We're displaying the full name of the doctor. It's just called display text as the alias for the column in the stored procedures select statement. And the ID is stored internally, same as we've done before. Okay, so here I have my text box. You'll notice in the video, because I took this code so it matches the video. I was in a hurry when I did it and I forgot to change the name. I started off just looking in the last name, and we changed it later to use the summary so we can be checking the first and last name together because they're put together in the summary. And I forgot to change the name of the text box, which is why it's still not quite perfect, okay? But at least it's consistent with the video, right? And then we have our date range, our txt start and txt end. Right? Oh darn, I didn't mean to do that. This is an example of accidentally adding an event handler that we don't want. So if I take this out, by the way, if you leave it there, it clutters your code, but it doesn't cause an error. And if I go back to the page, let's go to the source, and there I can see it was added. By the way, that's a bit of a tip if you hadn't noticed before. If in design view you select a control first and then go to source, it will be highlighted. Right? It makes it easy to find the control. Okay? So I can see here's the on text changed. I don't want that. I'll just delete that. It was an accident adding that. Okay. But notice that beside these text boxes, I do have some compare validators, right? I'm just manually adding some validation here because I don't want to have somebody entering a value for this start or end date range for the date of birth and have it not be a date, right? So this first compare validator is set up only to do the data type check, okay? Operators data type check, type date, right? So that's all it does, is make sure whatever's entered there is a valid date. The second one actually does do a comparison, and it makes sure not only that it's a valid date, but that it's greater than or equal to the first one. Now remember, if they're left blank, the compare validator doesn't care. It doesn't validate an empty text box, right? Only if something is entered. So it's not a problem if we leave either one of them blank. The compare validators will just basically be doing a data type check if there is anything entered. But this has the added value of making sure, because between is set up with that in mind, right? Between A and B, well, A is supposed to come before B, okay? So this is a way we can make sure that the date entered isn't in the wrong order, right? Just by using our little bit of validation controls that way. Okay, so that's basically it for that. We did also throw a validation summary on the page just because to see the error messages from those compare validators. There's no actual validation here related to entering data, right? Because we're not maintaining data, we're just showing it, but it's really here just for our filter to make sure the proper type of information is entered in our text box. Nothing to do here, because if it's, we're looking for characters of any type, so we can't say anything about that. Any characters are good enough. Let's see it actually run. I hope it does. Okay, so we're up and going. So we're just seeing a list of the patients, right? I do have a link here to go to the patients page where you could add patients, delete patients, and so on. Okay, that's just a separate page setup. But you know, we can just check that things do filter. So if I don't know, go to Gregory House, click filter. Oh, that's a little thing that I talked about in the video. Notice that I took off that option to have it post back, auto post back. I don't want it going back to the server whenever I select a new item out of the drop-down list, because I might have 2 or 3 things I want to filter by. They're filtered Gregory House and, you know, something about the name or the date range, right? So we wait till we actually click the filter button before it posts back to the server. And there we go. So now we're filtering for Gregory House. We just see him. We can go back to all doctors, and away we go. I think I was a good boy, and if there's no patients, do I have any doctors here with no patients? I might not. Anyway, there is something in the empty data template to let you know that no patients match your criteria. All right, so that's good. By the way, our clear button, of course, we have the option set that it doesn't cause validation, right? We don't want to have to worry about clearing anything first. It should just go back and refresh the whole page. It again uses that same trick we learned at the very beginning of this section of the course about response redirect, asking for a fresh copy of the page. Easiest way to clear everything and put it back to the original state. Okay, so let's do the date range, right? So I can see my dates here. They range from 1964 up to 1990 for the year. So if I put in something like 1970 and filter, then see it cut down, so everybody who was born before 1970 has now been removed, right? Because they weren't, it's not after that date, it was before that date. If I, no, okay, so we have some 1989, so if I go 1990, 01, 01, right? Oh, I hit clear. Can I go back? No. Okay, so right, then the only 2 left are the 2 that are actually between those dates, right? Now if I take out the first date, filter again, then my 1964 and 65 people are back, right? Because it's before, that's everybody who was born before this date. So that's a pretty easy interface to work with. Take very little training to get the user to understand how to do that. They can either have it everything after the start date, everything before the end date, or if you put both in, it'll just be what's between them, right? Okay, so let's deal with this patient summary. You see, we can actually, because the date is part of it, we can search for that. I can search for 1990. Now, if I do a starts with, okay, no patients match the criteria because nobody's name starts with 1990, but if I switch to contains, then everybody with 1990 somewhere inside their summary, right, will be included in the output. If I do the letter F, okay, then if there's an F anywhere inside the patient summary, then they're included in the output. If I switch back to a starts with, then only the Flintstones are there. Okay, they're the only ones that their last name starts with the letter F. So very straightforward logic, good simple interface. Obviously, with a lot more sample data, it'd be a bit more interesting to see it in action, but you see that it does actually work. Okay, now the trickiest part is this starts with versus contains. I do explain it in the video that's posted, but just to summarize it for you now, basically what happens is the data that's being supplied to our grid view gets cached, right? If we change any of these controls, the system is smart enough to realize these are all control parameters, right? These controls are used to provide values to parameters. So any change to any of these 4 controls will automatically signal the system to let it know it's going to have to go back and forget the cache data. It has to refresh it right from the database. Okay, and that's good. Caching is good. It makes the responsiveness of our overall web application much better. If there's no indication that anything should have changed, then we'll just use the cache data, right? So these, being actual specified control parameters, force a refresh from the database, but my radio button group here does not, right? Because it's not actually mentioned as a control parameter. What we're doing is, in code, we're deciding whether to add the extra wildcard character to the front of the string, right? So, again, that's explained in the video, but just to show you in code, come on, stop running. Okay, took a little while to get it stopped, but now we're stopped. So, okay, let me focus on that then. First of all, let me come back here to DS patients. We'll switch to the source. And you see what I mean? Like, all these are mentioned as control parameters, right? We have 4 different controls that provide value for our parameters of our stored procedure. So those are the IDs, okay? The name, okay? The property of the parameter, selected value, and so on, versus the text property and things like that. But notice that all the ones that pulled value from strings have this convert empty string to null set to false. That's that option we got to that advanced link in our dialog box as we went through the wizard. But we could have just come in here and done it right in the HTML of the page, right? So those 4, any changes to these particular controls will trigger an automatic refresh of the whole data from the database instead of using cache data. But our radio button list here, okay, does not. So we might end up with cache data, and our filter wouldn't actually change from a contains to a starts with, right? So what we have to do then is add on selected index changed, okay? Basically, when they select a different option in the radio button list, it triggers this event. So that event in our code behind is this one right here, selected index changed. So all we do is that same trick that we did before when we talked about refreshing data-bound controls, just reassign back again the same data source, okay, to the data source ID of the grid view. And that forces it to actually refresh the data from the database. So that's how we're saying, I know you're not a control parameter. The system can't be smart enough to know that we have to get a fresh copy of the data by changing the option here. But this will actually do the job for us then. That's an extra little twist you have to be aware of. Okay. Our clear button is just our response redirect. We talked about that. Okay. So here is the selecting, okay? The before event for the data source control itself, right? So here's where we decide if the radio button list, our filter option, the selected value is contains as opposed to starts with, then what we want to do is we're going to actually go into the parameters being passed to the stored procedure, grab the @InName parameter, remember that's the one we created inside the stored procedure, and add to the value of the parameter, okay, the actual wildcard character at the beginning. That logically means we'll find the text we're specifying here anywhere contained inside of the field itself, okay, the patient summary. So that's the little trick that helps us switch back and forth between a contains and a starts with. Everything else is pretty straightforward. There's nothing else really here in our code, right? We don't have any validation to worry about. We don't need to use dynamic validation or anything. We aren't changing data through this page. So that's basically it. The only other thing I might mention, you might have noticed the script manager. You say, what is that about? Yes?
Just a quick question about the radio button.
Oh yeah, sure.
So the reason you can't do that inside of like a stored procedure is because it's not a control parameter?
That's right. So
or else you could source it. Like you could add that code in the...
you're absolutely right. You could set this up as a control parameter to pass a value to the stored procedure and then make a decision in the stored procedure. Yeah? Yeah, I'm sure you could make that work. All right, good thought. Okay, this script manager is on the page because what I have here is an update panel. Did you do some work with Ajax in your web? No? Well, the idea is, let me just run it again and show you the effect. Our web forms, the one thing that some people complain about, although actually there's a lot of automatic caching even of parts of the page going on now, but people complain that they're chatty with the server, that every time you click a button it's going back to the server, getting a fresh copy of the page, right? And that's where Ajax comes into play in a lot of client-side web page development, is instead of going and getting a whole new chunk of HTML for the grid, for example, you just go and you get the data, right? And then you repopulate the grid with the new version of all the data. And it's less, fewer packets of information going back and forth between the client and the server, so it gives you some efficiency that wasn't there before, right, by using Ajax. If you've ever manually done a lot of work doing Ajax calls, there's a lot of programming involved, okay? That's something we used to have you do in PROG1198 is you'd spend weeks, you know, writing these very lengthy procedures just to save a little bit of data being going back and forth. And then I would come along in web forms and show you all you do is stick it inside an update panel and it's all Ajaxified automatically. And students would groan and say, why didn't you show us this earlier, right? So basically this whole page is done using Ajax. So normally you'll see the little tab up here flicker, right? Because it's actually gone to the server, it's getting a brand new copy of the whole page. But when I do these filters, right, it's all happening just with the Ajax call. So it's actually only sending data back and forth. It's not sending all the HTML of the page back and forth. Really makes a bigger difference if you have images, things like that, right? You know, those don't get disturbed at all, and things like that. The only time it doesn't is when I click clear, because it asks for a fresh copy of everything. So you will notice a little bit of a flicker in, you know, in the tab up here when I click the clear button, right? See how that just disappeared for a second? Because it actually got a whole fresh copy of the page. But all the other filters are done just by putting it inside of an update panel. So if I, you know, do multiple filters, nobody has an E? How about that? How about an I? Oh, it's because I'm on starts with. There we go. Lots of people, I'm sure, have E's somewhere in there, right? So all that data exchange is happening just with little Ajax calls as opposed to refreshing the whole page. Something that I would have got into more, but I just thought I'd just mention it. It's in this example. All it really is in the source code, okay, is you actually have to have that script manager. That's all you do, is you stick it on the page. You don't have to change anything about it. But what the script manager does is it looks and sees what elements on the page require certain types of JavaScript, and it manages and makes sure the right JavaScript libraries are provided, except for unobtrusive JavaScript. We still have to look after that ourselves, right? But then down here, what we're doing is, oh, where's my update panel? Control to find. Okay. So everything inside this ASP update panel, right, will actually exchange its data with the server. It has a content template. So everything inside the content template is the content of the update panel. And it also has triggers. So the triggers is where you actually say, okay, we will trigger an update of the content of this panel when this happens, right? So async postback trigger, so it'll asynchronously post back when the control ID button filter gets clicked. So when we click the filter button, even though the filter button is actually outside of the panel, it goes and actually executes its code and gets the new copy of the data. So I just thought I'd explain that because it is in here. Feel free, there's in the tutorials, there's lots of information on update panels and AJAX, right? But it's beyond the scope. You're not responsible for that, but I just wanted to share it with you. Any questions about that? Okay. Now I did have one other page in here where I did add a little bit of code to show you our last topic we're going to talk about. So let me stop and start recording.